So I mentioned I would go over some of the temperature sensors that I have set up, kind of how I have them set up, why I have them set up, and how I personally use it, and maybe it'll be interesting to other folks in the tropical fruit community. Maybe this is something that you weren't aware of that you could do. It's not very expensive, and it doesn't really take a lot of effort. If you're technically inclined, it's something that's kind of just it's pretty straightforward to figure out. But if you're not technically inclined, there's a lot of resources out there. And just check around on like the Home Assistant forums and different communities, and even YouTube. There's a lot of good channels out there that kind of get you set up. So this isn't really a tutorial video, but more of a use of technology video, and kind of how I use it. And my way is not the best way, it's just the way I do it, and this is kind of why. But essentially my goal with the temperature sensors really was to understand the microclimate of my yard, and understand, like, because I am kind of pushing the limits here a little bit in zone 9B, especially with these potted plants. They don't have the same protection that you would with a plant in the ground. Even the plants in the ground, sometimes it gets really cold here in 9B. And even after the USDA hardiness map update, we moved closer to 10A. We're pretty dang close now, actually. But where we are now, we're still getting below freezing temperatures every now and then. Like 3 years ago, we got a 28-degree night twice in a row. It toasted my first mango tree, which I have a temperature sensor on. It's dangling from its neck, essentially. So I'm really wanting to understand exactly how does temperature, that's forecast, correlate to actual temperature in the yard. I think that's something that's very useful for anybody kind of, pushing these limits. Again, I think with the proper, with a properly managed yard, some of these things are not as big of a concern. But for me, we moved here 4 years ago. I'm still learning exactly where the cold spots, the warm spots are in the yard. Generally the south side up against the house is going to be the warmest and gets the most sunlight. But you might be surprised to see, where it's actually coolest and warmest and so on, with actual data to look at. So again, with those back-to-back 28 degrees when we first got here, we plopped the mango tree in the yard. We didn't really have any microclimate or anything set up. The tree got burnt. It lost all of its new growth from August. It was, like a little twig at that point, so it didn't really have any, mass to it. So it was even more susceptible to cold damage. I think, we have other mango trees in the neighborhood that, they lose some leaves whenever it gets below freezing, but they come back even stronger. Like, I'm not worried about not being able to grow a mango tree. It's just more of making sure that things get established and just kind of learning how the yard works. So this is really why I'm doing this. Now, just to show you how these sensors work in Home Assistant, which is the software I'm using here, I've got it running on a Raspberry Pi. I've got some, cheap radio USB dongles, essentially, that communicate with these Accurite sensors, and they're just giving me humidity and temperature back. But you can kind of see, I can see down to the freaking minute, which is awesome, exactly how hot or cold it was. And I can do this for each of these sensors. And so if I hop into like the mango tree, we can see, last night I got down to 46. We got up to 60 during the day, and then it's going to shoot down to supposedly 37 tonight. So we are in the Brandon area, just outside of Tampa. And yeah, so this is going to be very useful information for me tonight, because it's been a year since I started, well, maybe a year and a half since I started using these sensors. And I want to see, with all the new growth that I've had in my yard, improvements to the soil health over time, how much is that actually, how much better is it going to be for my trees now that this has happened? Does it affect the temperature? I don't know. Just things that are interesting. But anyways, to stay on topic. So I've got, one in the kind of on my lanai. So this is on the protected overhang. So there's like the one that's more exposed to air, but then I've got a sensor on a table that can kind of tell me like how cold does it get in that, basically the protected seating area. So I like to put my seedlings there. You know, whenever, you know, just generally I keep them under there because it's warmer. There's no wind. It tends to be a little more humid in there too, which is good for some plants. So I've got some of the potted jackfruit seeds, you know, under the overhang right now. I'm not really too worried about them getting cold tonight because I know, you know, you can even see here it's 53.8 degrees in that overhang versus, you know, the side yard, which is 47.5 right now. So that's really vital information. That means, you know, if I'm worried about any of my potted plants on my lanai, I can just shove them under the overhang and I know it's going to be, you know, several degrees warmer. And Florida is kind of interesting because, you know, when it gets cold, as you can see here, it gets cold for like, the coldest is like under an hour in the morning. This is some other information that's really useful to see too, because it takes a little bit of time for it to be cold enough, long enough for it to actually damage your plants. So you could get down to below freezing for, you know, a minute or two. But, you know, plants are mostly water, and water takes a little bit of time to cool down and heat up. So you've got some buffer there, and because we're in Florida, you know, we've got this, it's a really just dramatic change in temperature all of a sudden. So that's why, you know, you see people in California, they're like, you know, California is different from Florida. Well, that's because in Florida, technically, you know, we're zone 9B, you know, the lowest average temp is going to be in your low 30s, right? Or is it, I can't remember if it's 25 to 30, or is it 30 to 35? Somewhere between 25 and 35. I don't remember off the top of my head. But the reason that Florida is better at growing tropical plants is because of this. It doesn't last that long. So it's the lowest average temp. And, you know, in California, I believe that it will stay cold like this. That is the difference. So in Florida, we really can, you know, get away with a lot more just because this little peak happens very, very quickly. And, you know, it's back up to 60s in the day, even though it was 30 degrees at night. It's crazy. But anyway, so this is useful information. Even if you're in California, you can kind of see, you know, how does it behave when the sun's down, you know, versus sun up. You know, you might have some spots that might behave more like this than others. I don't know. So if you're in California, you want to try this. This is very, very useful information, especially if you're trying to form microclimates. So that's essentially why I'm doing this. You know, other than like I'm automating my home entirely, like I can turn all my lights on and off remotely, which that's a little more expensive, but I tend to go overboard with that kind of stuff. But the other thing is that, like, you can see my plant stand is right here. I can turn this thing on and off remotely. I can also schedule timers through software to turn the lights on and off on my plant, on my little plant stand that I call it, which is where all my little seedlings are at that I care a little bit more about than others. So it's very powerful. You know, I can even hook up my open source sprinkler controller to it for my lawn watering. I've disabled a lot of zones. A good example of how this is useful though is whenever I was traveling to Europe a couple of years ago, I have a bunch of potted plants. You know, they're kind of like pets, right? You gotta water them, you gotta feed them when you're gone. You can't just leave them, otherwise they'll dry out. That's kind of a disadvantage of having things in pots. You got to take care of them like a pet, you know. And so I'm able to actually come in here remotely and turn on, you know, my sprinklers if I wanted to. So that was really useful for me. You know, we left during July, so it wasn't as big of a deal. You know, that was like 3 years ago we did that. But, you know, we didn't have the drought that we had this year, so it rained most of the time. I didn't necessarily have to water them, but it was kind of my backup plan. But anyway, so these are some things that you can do in relation to, you know, your tropical plants, or it doesn't even have to be tropical plants, really. You know, to utilize modern technology, you know, stuff that's available to you at your home from Amazon. This is just really cool. It's not super expensive. I'll kind of go into what exactly I have. So I just get these little 16 buck and a quarter, Accurite temperature sensors. I'm sure you could use other sensors. I chose Accurite just because that's what people had documentation on. And I'll get to exactly how I figured out how to set these up with Home Assistant. There's another guy's channel who covers this pretty in depth with how to set these things up on Home Assistant. So again, not a tutorial, just kind of a general knowledge transfer. But I've got 4 of these set up. There's a radio dongle, and he has it in his video of which one to buy for your Raspberry Pi or whatever other hardware that you're using. You can use any computer really. But got 4 of these guys. They do pretty good. Again, it's $16 and a quarter. They say don't leave them out in the sun. I'm not really sure why. Probably because they don't want them to get damaged and be have people mad that their temperature sensors got damaged. But it could also be that when the sun shines on them, the temperature seems to spike. So like my one on the south side of the house, the sun is shining on it all day. It'll get up to like 160 degrees or something like that. Maybe not that high, maybe more like 125. But I'm not really concerned about how hot it gets. I'm concerned about how cool it gets. Specifically at nighttime. And at nighttime, I get really accurate readings because the sun's not shining on it anymore. And again, I've had these for like a year and a half or something like that. 16 bucks, year and a half. If they crapped out on me now, I don't really care. They take AA batteries too. I haven't had to replace the AA's in them since then. So at worst, it costs you 20 bucks every year and a half. At least in my experience, and I haven't gone past a year and a half yet. I wouldn't be surprised if it lasted another year or two before I have to replace them. If I even have to, I don't know. But again, it's like 10 bucks a year. Can't go wrong, per sensor anyways. So these are just what I use. So these are the, if you can't see it, it's the Accurite Temp and Humidity 0600 2M, the white ones. I think these other ones are just temperature. So I like to know the humidity too, so I got the slightly more expensive one. It's going to be 14 bucks versus 16 bucks. Might as well grab the humidity too. But again, I'll add this link in the video, but Slacker Labs has a really good in-depth tutorial on exactly how to set this stuff up. He created his own add-on for Home Assistant to enable, speaking to these radio temperature humidity sensors through Home Assistant and on your Raspberry Pi. So you get this wonderful historical temperature data. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope that was interesting and inspires someone to do something useful to your growing. I don't really have much else to say. If anyone has any questions or ideas that maybe you would want me to try, I'm definitely interested in that. Just leave some comments. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Just let me know if y'all have any questions. And thanks for listening to me ramble on.